Brandon, I'll start with you. We were watching a bit of that Blazers Nets game yesterday. What was your impression on the Blazers so far, not only in that game, but in the bubble throughout?
So the Blazers are an interesting team because you could argue that the Blazers had a. So the Blazers throughout the season, everybody knew they were good. Like they didn't lose a bunch of players, coming off of last year's like
Right.
arguably kind of ridiculous
I mean,
run in the playoffs.
they didn't have
Um,
Nurkic, they didn't have
right.
Collins. Now they get him back. Yeah.
They had a fairly implausible run in the playoffs last year. I mean, they knocked off OKC. They knocked off Houston, I believe. No, not Houston. Houston went on to play Golden
Golden
State.
State. Either way.
But basically, they lost to Golden State. But point being, they come back this year and they had a pretty good season. However, one of the things that they had to deal with is a lot of their main players kept getting hurt throughout the season, so they didn't really play as a whole team solidified. I believe this is one of the only games that they've played with like everybody on the floor available. And it showed that when they have a full squad that can play together, it makes them so much more dangerous, and they can afford to have a quote-unquote worse-off game from Dame Lillard, who
Was it really worse off? He
didn't
scored
have
42.
60 points. Oh no, he only had 42 points in a game, which is insane. I mean, I believe I saw somewhere that he's like one of the only people to have in 1 month have like 60, 40, 30, 60 or something like that.
Yeah.
It's like, basically, watching the game, some people might have thought, oh wow, the Blazers looked a little bit worse for wear, but I would remind people that the Blazers only won most of their games down the stretch by like 3 points, 4 points, 2 points, 1 point, 2 points. So they're not exactly like going to destroy a team. And I will say this, one thing that I very much agree with, I agree with Charles Barkley on Inside the NBA. He made a very good point that they need to play defense.
Yeah.
That team doesn't play defense at all.
No.
Like they're up there because they can shoot the ball and score the ball at will. Like anybody on that team can score. But if they're not going to play defense, even against even though we keep making the point that the Lakers like only have two guys who really bring the point, the big scoring. In AD and LeBron. The Lakers are still good. They still have lots of good talent, and they're still going to find a way to win. Even though you have to ask the question, how good are the Lakers on defense themselves?
Right. And I think it brings up an interesting point, too, because the Lakers, I believe they played Denver earlier in the week, and they finally started to look like themselves, but defensively it was still pretty terrible. One of the pieces that is interesting that I know some people have mentioned with Portland is Hassan Whiteside.
Yeah.
And I know that that's really random, but him off the bench makes so much more sense for them. Because, he's just a rebounding machine anyway. But how much does a rebounding machine, guys like Andre Drummond, Hassan Whiteside, those two are pretty much the big two right now in the league, how much does that really help you in your starting lineup? But in your bench, in a limited role, he can actually be really helpful. And with Nurkic and Collins, that tandem with those three have definitely helped them, I think, as a whole. Yeah. Shane, what's been your perspective on Portland throughout this 8-game seeding schedule?
I've been shocked, to say the least. I mean, going into the bubble, they obviously weren't. I mean, I thought they could have a chance at the 8th seed, but they weren't exactly on my radar because we're all thinking about Memphis, of course, who was in the 8th seed, and then New Orleans because I got Zion, so that's a big thing that everyone's looking at. But then, here's Portland, being sneaky and doing their thing. And offensively, they're just insane. I mean, Damian Lillard is probably the best 3-point shooter in the bubble right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know, like Brandon said, you know, defensively they haven't looked great, which doesn't work in their favor because, you know, it's great if you can score, but you know, you got to be able to back it up too, and stop other teams like LA Lakers who have good scorers as well. You know, so yeah, I think if those two played in the first round, it would be very high octane, high scoring series without a doubt. You know, I mean, the Lakers they have their own issues. They have some injury concerns. LeBron didn't exactly look like himself a couple games ago against, I think it was Denver. You know, so it's and obviously not having guys like Rondo and
Avery Bradley, who opted out as well.
Yeah. So, you know, but they still have, I think obviously this is the age of the duos in the NBA. You got LeBron, AD, which, you know, they're still there. They'll still be good. So, you know, that's what is important. Just to at least have, you know, your strong core for a series like that against a team like Portland. But then, you know, you get later on in the playoffs, and then I don't know, that gets a bit more questionable. But we'll talk about that later.
Yep. And then I'll continue with you, Shane, as well with Memphis. Memphis, to me, as a whole, have not really been that interesting in the bubble so far. I don't know how competitive they'll actually be, especially with losing a big piece in Jaren Jackson Jr. Do you think Ja Morant can do enough against Portland and this high-octane offense that they have?
I don't think so. I think Memphis is still just too young. You know, they were in kind of you know, I think the reason that they were in the 8th seed to begin with is because, you know, Portland was having you know, issues before the season delay, and you know, New Orleans didn't have Zion, and then you didn't have a team like Phoenix that was red hot, you know what I mean? And so because of that, I almost felt like they were just kind of in that 8th seed by default in a way, if that makes sense. And so no, I don't think you know, I don't think Ja Morant has the you know, the experience and the kind of the playing ability yet to just go in and take on Damian Lillard, who, in my opinion, is probably the second or third best point guard in the NBA, and or I mean, he's up there, and yeah, I mean, I just, you know, I don't think this is their year, but you know, I definitely think that they're on a good track for the future. So, you know, I don't look down on them if they don't get it done.
Mm-hmm. And then Brandon, do you feel the same way with Memphis? What's your perspective on them so far?
Yeah, I agree with Shane.
Oh, that's
Memphis, good. Memphis went something like 2-6 in the bubble, I think. Which makes me question, like, I think it's kind of BS that they're even in the play-in game. I mean, frankly, I think if you're going to consider the bubble to be a restart to the season, I would say that it really like Memphis has no place being in the play-in game, because you could make the argument that if this was a regular season, Memphis would not have been able to hold on to the 8th seed. And you know, I mean, look, you can make an argument that, like, yes, the Suns should be a play-in game between the Suns and Portland, but that's for another day. But I would say I don't think the Grizzlies are going to win one game. I don't think so. I think, if anything, the Grizzlies can walk away from all four teams in all four teams who were like in the running for the 8th or 9th seed can walk away from the bubble happy on some level. The Spurs, Popovich should be thrilled with how his young team looked.
Look at
Like-
how DeMar DeRozan played, by the way, in this bubble.
You're
My
right.
God.
You can make the argument that like, okay, they didn't make it into the playing game, but like they're a young team. They played pretty well, and they just came up short. The Suns, my God, this is the best Suns team I've seen in
Since like the Stoudemire
decades.
era, bro. Like,
in a
07.
decade, literally a decade. The biggest thing about the Suns team is that they were actually taking accountability as a team, like whether they won or whether they lost. They played as a team, they won as a team. I mean, Portland, of course, continued to show that they're going to be in the running for the next couple of years. I think the one big thing that I think Portland needs to think about, though, is they have a couple spots that are held by veterans, by people who are getting older, that honestly, I think they could run into the same problem that a lot of basketball teams have. They could run into the problems that the Celtics had in the early 2010s, when they had like those great teams that like were amazing, but they were very much veteran run, and they like ended up falling off for a long time. And then of course you come back to Memphis, and I think out of the four of them, Memphis is the one that's going to have the most rebuilding to do, but they have some key good pieces there. But honestly, out of all four teams, if I'm Memphis, I'm the team that going like, what the hell happened? Like, how did we come into the bubble with a 3-game lead and lose it? Like,
I mean, I think it's very simple, right? If you're talking about Memphis, you're talking about missing Jaren Jackson Jr. He's just such a big part of what they do. And now you look at Memphis and you say, this is a future team now.
yeah.
I mean, they're just filled with so much young talent, and it's just they're going to be so good next year in a stacked Western Conference. The Western Conference is only going to get better as we go along throughout the next 4 or 5 years, and Memphis is certainly going to be in that mix.